So I'm here tonight to give you some information on controlling and managing tree of heaven. And it is a highly invasive tree species, but also one of the preferred hosts for spotted lanternflies. So kind of double jeopardy with this particular plant. We're going to talk initially about some quick ID characteristics that you can utilize to help you identify this tree in the field. It is also called the stink tree, Chinese sumac, stinking sumac, and some other names. And the stink part is pretty accurate. It's got a very strong odor to any of the crushed plant parts, and many people describe it as smelling like rancid peanut butter. It's a large, fast-growing tree that grows very rapidly and get to be quite large in size, both originally from Asia, very long, multiple-leaved compound leaves that are alternately arranged on the very stout twigs. And the leaflets have entire margins, meaning they're not toothed all along the margins, but they do have these little glands that are at the base of the leaves. And there's typically 1 to 3 of those glands at the very base of the leaves, and that helps us separate this from things like black walnut and sumacs, which either have serrated leaf margins, teeth along the margins, or they lack these little glands at the base in our entire leaf margins. And we've got a picture of that as well. So you can see that little node sticking out away from the leaf, and then underneath we see the gland there. So really good identification characteristic for the leaves on Tree of Heaven. We mentioned the really stout twigs. So it needs a great big stout twig to hold those large leaflets and leaves. They can be 2 feet long in some cases. The leaf scars are heart-shaped or V-shaped, just depending on the orientation of the leaves. And then very large pith in the center of the twigs that tends to be a tan to brown color. The bark on these trees tends to be a gray with white wormy marks on younger trees. And then in some cases on older trees, we'll actually get this really highly figured bark that almost can look like a cantaloupe skin in some conditions. It does have male and female trees. And so we have the females that produce the seed, and females can produce tens to hundreds of thousands of seed per tree. And they can produce it quite young, just a few years old, and they can become productive. So once again, those very highly invasive characteristics we see in many plants like this. The seed is a little papery wing structure that carries the seed, and in strong winds can carry that seed a long distance away from parent plants. So it's very easy for it to spot fire into new locations because of that. Seeds typically mature starting in September and October, but they're oftentimes held onto the tree through winter and dispersed through that whole period up until spring. Some of its characteristics that lend to its invasive and aggressive nature are also its capacity to root sprout prolifically and produce really large clonal communities, coming oftentimes from one single root system, but dominating an area because of the density of the root sprouting, and also the fact that they can grow very rapidly and outpace most of our native tree and shrub species. And so this provides them another additional advantage over our natives and makes them, in particular, very aggressive invaders. The other problem is that if we're not careful about how we manage these, we make these problems worse. And so simply cutting or girdling these stems will also prompt an additional root sprouting response. And so we can go from one stem that we've killed to literally dozens of stems in many cases if we don't use proper management techniques, which we're going to talk about tonight. To give you an example of the growth rate potential on these, I don't really think this is probably a 1-year-old seedling. I think it's probably 2, but here it is in a cornfield outpacing the corn. And I have certainly seen that in woodland settings. 1-year-old seedlings get 3 or 4 feet tall in some cases, and by the second season, they can really fly. And so with so many of our invasive species, we really need to be thinking about a system. And the fact that we are never looking at a one and done treatment to be effective in our management of these invasives. And that's very true of invasive tree of heaven. So we're looking at early detection and rapid response. And so we want to find these on the landscape, hopefully before they're setting seed. And so that's one of the things we want to do is try to prevent seed spread, because that simply magnifies and expands the invasion that we've already got. Then how do we effectively control plants, recognizing with this particular plant that managing root sprouts along with preventing seed is critical to getting a handle on control. And in all these cases, we almost always have to return to sites and monitor our results and mop up any additional sprouts or seedlings that are coming up to make sure that we don't miss those infestations and they grow over time and create additional problems. So it's a step-by-step process that is always more than just one application or 1 year of treatment. There is some good news potentially on the horizon with this particular invasive, and that is that there is a very promising biological control agent that may be available very soon. There is a fungal disease that was found naturally infecting tree of heaven in several eastern states, and most recently it's been found in Ohio, perhaps maybe even a couple of other states. We're still looking to try to confirm it in Indiana. I don't believe it's been confirmed here yet. But this is a really promising potential treatment to help us in the combat against this particular plant. And so these trees here are currently being infested by this fungus. You're seeing wilting and thinning of the crowns. And so this is a verticillium wilt fungus that is naturally occurring here in the eastern United States. The states that we've found it in so far are Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Ohio. And it has a pretty good capacity to spread rapidly through tree of heaven stands. And so once areas get infested with this, it's a pretty good control on the stems of tree of heaven. It doesn't control all stems, but it provides us an opportunity to get ahead of some of these infestations and make control potentially much less expensive. The other good news is that in the screenings that the Forest Service and several other research organizations are doing on this, it does not look like it's a really virulent fungal pest of any of our other native plants. There have been a few plants, I believe sumac and perhaps a small maple or two, that have shown some symptoms in areas where they've used this, but we haven't had any really significant species impacts outside of tree of heaven so far. And some of that screening continues. So it's currently still being evaluated, but there's an actual application for use with USDA and some other entities to approve it as a biological control for tree of heaven. So hopefully that will be something that we'll have available in the future. It would be great if we've got it here in the state that we find it, because it may make our application to get this utilized in the state easier since it's already native here. So keep your eyes out for wilting tree of heaven. And one of the other characteristics is actually this yellow under the bark. Typically, a healthy tree of heaven will have a light color underneath the bark. So this yellowing is a really good sign that the disease is in place. If you find trees like that, contact the Department of Natural Resources or your extension office or Purdue Extension. We'd be very interested in hearing about those trees. Now, until we have that biological control agent, we've got to use a variety of other techniques. And it's going to require quite a bit of work on our part because this is a really significant invasive pest. But one of the tools we've got is foliar applications of several herbicides. And these can be actually quite efficient and effective if we apply them correctly. And so one of the materials is glyphosate at 2 to 3% of the concentrate in water. Another one is a broadleaf herbicide, triclopyr, in its water-soluble formulation. And we'll talk about these different particular herbicides a little bit later, at 1.5 to 2%, plus a non-ionic surfactant. And both of these would be in water. But to be effective, we've got to get complete coverage of the leaf area to get consistent control. You can see how challenging that would be in a situation like this. So we need, for larger trees and big, heavy infestations, high pressure equipment and the capacity to get this across the foliage of the trees. And there's inevitably going to be some underneath or in the corners that we don't get. And so mop-up operations after these initial applications are always going to be required. And so the equipment you use and your application techniques are going to depend on the size and the height of these infestations. And in some cases, it's just not going to be practical to use a foliar application. It typically has been most effective in the second half of the growing season, and that's true for many foliar applications on woody plants. Another application that's had good efficacy, although it's pretty intensive in terms of the effort involved in the amount of herbicide and materials that it takes, is basal bark applications of herbicides to the lower stems of tree of heaven. And so we're typically using a triclopyr ester herbicide, which is an oil-based herbicide and soluble in oil. So garland 4 and triclopyr 4 would be typical materials. There are some others also available in that triclopyr family of herbicides. And in most cases, we're using about 20% herbicide and about 80% carrier oil. And the carrier oils can be actually commercially available basal oils, which are intended for use with these herbicides. But also on the label is fuel oil, kerosene, or diesel. Now, we're typically recommending people use the basal oil for application just to make sure that you're not risking yourself and also risking additional potential harm to the environment by putting those petrochemicals out there. But they are on the label, and they can be utilized if you need to. And we're putting that herbicide on the lower 15 to 18 inches of the stem, using low pressure, starting at the top of the application point and kind of working down the stems, and also just allowing that oil to spread around the stems, just so that the lower stems are covered, but we're not getting runoff onto the soil. One of the issues we run into with this application is in really high temperatures in the summer, 85 degrees plus, this mixture of herbicide and oil can volatilize and actually form a herbicide fog in the understory of forests. And so you've got two bad things happening. You've got the herbicide that's coming off of your point of application, the plant you want to control, and it's impacting plants you probably don't want to control. So some of our understory herbaceous plants and shrubs. So be careful about high temperature applications. And also the label indicates that it should not be applied in snow or during rain. So June to March, ideal times to be applying this, but be careful about those particular situations. One of the great advantages of this particular application is it tends to short circuit the root sprouting potential of tree of heaven. And so when we cut these stems off, or we girdle these stems, we almost invariably get really significant root sprouting, whether we use herbicide on those cut surfaces or not. With basal bark applications, to a great extent, much of that root sprouting is limited or eliminated. And so you can see the application here on these stems. Now, for many trees, girdling, cutting a ring or two rings all the way around the circumference of the tree, through the bark, through the cambium into the sapwood, or what we call frilling, taking an axe or another tool and hacking a frill all the way around the circumference of the tree and putting herbicide in it, are very effective controls for those trees. And we can top kill tree of heaven with these techniques too. The problem is that it triggers that root sprouting response. And so you might go from one stem that you killed to literally dozens, if not in some cases hundreds, of root sprouts coming up from that killed top. So we've got to remember that this approach will not suppress the root sprouting response that tree of heaven has. So we can literally multiply our problems by attempting this technique without follow-up management. Now, a technique very similar, but just with some slight differences that are very important, actually is very effective on controlling tree in heaven. And this is called the hack and squirt technique. And this is where we're using a cutting tool that's got a relatively narrow cutting surface, 1.5 to 2 inches of blade. So a ground down hatchet or a shingling hatchet can work really well. We make downward angled cuts, 30 to 45 degrees, spaced out around the diameter of the tree. And we're evenly spacing these and leaving some uncut surface between those spaced cuts. And then we'll take a herbicide and apply that into those pockets that we've created with that cut. And what that does is apparently it fools the tree into thinking that it's really not been significantly damaged. And we don't see that really strong root sprouting response that we get from full girdling or dropping the tree and creating a cut stump. And typically really effective at killing these trees. So that would be an efficient, effective technique to treat larger trees that either are too large or not practical to use basal bark on, but we're not going to be able to use foliar applications either. So this is really our kind of fallback technique for some of these larger trees and plants that are going to be difficult to treat otherwise. So as I mentioned, evenly spaced cuts around the circumference of the tree. Once we get those cuts made, we want to immediately apply our herbicide into those pockets, and just enough herbicide to fill in the pockets. We don't want it running down the sides of the tree excessively because that's essentially wasted herbicide. But this particular approach has been shown to be very effective. We can use glyphosate at anywhere from 50% concentrate in water to up to 100% concentrate, or Garlon 3A, which is the water-based triclopyr herbicides at 50 to 100% concentration as well. And so these are very effective at controlling tree of heaven and a really nice technique to utilize that. So here's an example of a ground down regular hatchet to produce a little bit smaller cutting surface that's going to be very efficient at the hack and squirt technique, or using a shingle hatchet. And then you can kind of pick your application technique. I typically use the middle one, the pull trigger squirt bottle, because I do find the oils are kind of hard on the seals of some of the other pressurized sprayers. But if you're willing to maybe do some parts replacement over time, or find one that's got good oil resistant seals, those are also very handy, and maybe you're a little easier to use on your hands if you're doing a lot of applications, and they'll have a little bit more volume as well. So it's really kind of pick what works best for you. Now, we do have some opportunities to use a variety of other techniques, but we almost always have some additional follow-up management to do. So mechanical techniques are available that we can utilize for working on tree of heaven, but it's going to require, in many cases, follow-up management and or chemical applications to take care of sprouting. So pulling small tree of heaven is certainly an option, but there's been a fair amount of evidence that any root fragments left behind can actually start new plants. And so pulling those full root systems is pretty challenging, even with some of the specialized tools that are available to do that. With really heavy infestations, there may be opportunities to use mulchers or a variety of other cutting tools to essentially get them all down to ground line. But we've got to recognize now we're going to have that root sprouting response. And so we're typically going to have to revisit that site pretty quickly, maybe that same season or early the next season, to start treating those root sprouts to make sure they don't completely overrun us and just completely outflank our capacity to get that site under control. So mechanical techniques can definitely be part of the toolkit, but it's typically not going to be the only part in terms of effectiveness at eliminating that infestation. And there's oftentimes some good reasons to utilize some of these mechanical techniques to either cut off stems or mulch stems, particularly if we're trying to limit seed production. So if you've got some female trees and they're being fruitful, producing seed, it's a really good idea to limit that production as quick as we can, because that's just a source of new infestations. And so we can do cut stump treatments or grinding these stems off, but we've got to recognize that we need to revisit those sites after that cutting practice, because we almost certainly are going to have root sprouting, and we may also have stump sprouting, and both of those can be very vigorous. If we don't follow that up within one season, in many cases those stems are now tall enough that we would need specialized equipment to actually treat them with foliar herbicides. So high pressure equipment that can reach high into canopies and the capacity to get into those locations with that. And that may not be realistic. And so our timing on these is oftentimes really critical, because these sprouts from established root systems and cut stumps can grow really vigorously, in some cases several feet in the first year. So if you've not treated it that year, it may be past your capacity to treat it. So what we recommend is, if you're going to use some of these mechanical techniques, have a 1-2 punch. So you're going to use the mechanical techniques to get these plants down to size to reduce or eliminate seed potential from mature plants. But you've got to come back after you've done that with a foliar application to kill those sprouts as quickly as you can, recognizing that they've got an enormous growth potential and that you may have a very large population from those root systems. So it's a technique that certainly can be part of your toolkit, but you've got to recognize you've got to put two things together, and you've got to time it very carefully in order to be effective in that process. And we always want to revisit sites to monitor the efficacy of the applications we've done to make sure we're really taking care of that population, knowing that Tree of Heaven at a relatively young age can start reproducing. Some of the herbicides we've mentioned that you can utilize. Glyphosate, a variety of trade names out there. We're typically looking at, as just in terms of efficiency, utilizing the concentrate, which varies in formulation, but most of it is equal to or greater than 41% active ingredients on the label. For foliar applications, we're mixing this with water, typically for woody plants at 2 to 3% concentrate. But we need to consider water quality, particularly with this herbicide. If we have high pH or hard water, it can be a real problem and start deactivating some of our active ingredients in the glyphosate. So if you've got that issue, a couple of options. You can collect rainwater or utilize softened water, or you can add 1 to 2 cups of spray-grade ammonium sulfate, that's a little granule, to your water before you add your herbicide. Or if you're using larger scale than a backpack, which is 3 to 4 gallons, if you're using tanks, you want to go at a rate of about 17 pounds of ammonium sulfate to 100 gallons of water. So add that first, allow it to dissolve. Then you can add your herbicide, your glyphosate, and it will typically be much more effective. We also typically recommend adding a non-ionic surfactant and dyes. The surfactant helps the herbicide actually penetrate into the plant by breaking surface tension, getting through the plant tissues, and then the dyes help you track where that application landed. And also, if you have gotten any of that material on yourself, for safety reasons, you can see, hey, I need to clean up these areas. The other approach we can take with glyphosate is cut stump and hack and squirt applications. And so on freshly cut surfaces, usually we want to be applying our herbicide within 5 or 10 minutes of cutting. You can apply the concentrate straight or diluted with up to 50% water. And I'm usually diluting it with 25 or 50% water. It seems to be very effective at those rates. But as we mentioned, that treatment must be on freshly cut surfaces, and it is most effective during the growing season. And if you've got strong sat flow during the spring, you want to avoid those applications because it's simply going to flush the herbicide out of the stems. The other material we've mentioned are the triclopyr materials, and there's several. Some of the trade names you'll see is Vastlan, Garlon 3A, Triclopyr 3A. These are the choline or amine formulations, which are water soluble. And then there's Garlon 4 or Triclopyr 4 and Pathfinder 2, which are the ester formulations, which are oil soluble. So the choline amine formulations are typically used for hack and squirt and cut stump treatments. And we're applying those undiluted or cut with 1-to-1 water ratio to herbicide. So 50% herbicide, 50% water. We can also use these for foliar applications at about 1.5 to 2% of the concentrate in our water. And then the ester formulations are mixed with oil, or for foliar applications, an oil water suspension. They're typically not labeled for girdle and frill applications. I know some people who utilize them for that, but we got to recognize that if it's not on the label, there may be some issues if we ever have any problems with applications. Essentially, the manufacturer is not saying it is necessarily tested or guaranteed for those type of applications. So typically, we don't recommend that. It is available for basal bark and cut stump applications. And as we mentioned, 15 to 20% herbicide in the balance of oil. And we're using commercially available basal oil or kerosene, diesel oil, or fuel oil. And there are opportunities to use this as a foliar application, and the label for your particular formulation will give you directions as to how to utilize that. And then we've got Pathfinder 2 in that same group that is a pre-mixed triclopyr ester, and it's a ready-to-use for basal bark or cut stump applications. And as we've mentioned, basal bark is one of those other applications that helps us defeat the root sprouting tendencies of tree of heaven. A few other options on herbicides. One that's been around a long time, Tordon RTU, meaning a ready-to-use formulation or pathway. This is pre-mixed and utilized for cut stump and girdle frill applications. Could be used for hack and squirt as well. Picloram and 2,4-D are the active ingredients. However, this material, although very effective at killing trees, can move in the soil. So you do have to be careful with the volume and targeting of applications. And I will tell you that tulip tree is incredibly sensitive to this. You'll see leaves curl up, and occasionally you'll even get some mortality on tulip tree in areas where you've used too much Tordon too close to the tulip trees. And then imazapyr products, and there's quite a few of them, are also very effective and can be used for a wide range of applications, as you can see here. But they are also very mobile, a lot of biological activity, and they have the capacity of killing or damaging non-target trees and plants in the area of application. So we typically recommend these for professional applications, folks that are experienced applicators, or in areas where pretty much all you've got is tree of heaven. If you've got that situation, this may be a decent product to utilize. Otherwise, you run risks of doing damage to non-target plants. And for, of course, any and all of these, we're always reading the labels, utilizing the safety gear and safe application information on those labels to protect ourselves and the environment in our applications for all of those. And because we mentioned these does not necessarily mean we're endorsing any of these materials, but it certainly is some guidance for you to think about what materials you could utilize in your applications. And one of the last things I'll mention is that not only is tree of heaven, as we mentioned, a really significant invasive plant threatening cities and towns, but also woodlands, tree plantings, almost any kind of natural area. It's got the potential to spread into and become a dominant plant in those locations. It also presents a health risk for some folks. There have been folks that have been controlling tree of heaven that have gotten a fair amount of sap on them or sawdust and have had a variety of medical conditions pop up. So some of it's as minor as dermatitis. For some folks, they've had some cardiopulmonary symptomology related to exposure to this plant. And so it's important that you recognize to take safety precautions in that respect too, and try not to produce any more sawdust or sap than you have to in the process of killing these. But our spotted lanternfly is attracted to and will utilize tree of heaven for almost every stage of its life. I think every stage, in fact, from what I've read. And so there's an important relationship there. This is also a potential really serious threat to a variety of plants in the landscape. And so if we can start doing a better job of controlling tree of heaven, it may be a tool for us to help limit the population growth of spotted lanternfly. Tree of heaven may also be able to be utilized as a sort of monitoring and trap tree for spotted lanternfly. And so some folks have recommended the possibility of leaving a few male tree of heaven. We want to eliminate the females to eliminate seed production, but leaving a few males to actually be able to monitor for spotted lanternfly, and maybe also be able to treat those trees with an insecticide that's systemic, so we could kill spotted lanternfly that comes to those locations. Now, decisions to do that, I think, ought to be made in consultation with professionals to help you make the best decisions for your property, but those may be options for helping us manage this potentially really problematic pest. And I definitely want to acknowledge that I am certainly not the source of all this information. I've had some experience with Tree of Heaven, but there's some wonderful sources of information out there. Penn State University's got a great site with information on Tree of Heaven and spotted lanternfly. Our State of Indiana Cooperative Invasives Management group has a really nice calendar of control for invasive plant management through the year. That's a really wonderful resource that gives you guidance for month by month, what are the best times to utilize different materials to control different invasive plants. The Midwest Invasive Plant Network also has a really nice control and management database that I utilize frequently for plants that maybe I have not done control on personally. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, West Virginia Tree of Heaven Control is another good resource. And then if you want to find out more about the verticillium wilt on Tree of Heaven, this USDA Forest Service site provides some good information on that as well. And I'll leave that just up for a second in case anybody wants to take a screenshot of that or a photo. Really good resources that I leaned on heavily for this presentation as well.